you for joining us. I want to welcome our witness to the subcommittee and thank Ranking Member Hyde-Smith for her continued partnership and commitment on this critically important issue. Before we begin, I want to take a moment to extend my sympathies to all of the families affected by the recent tornadoes across the South this weekend that left 6 perished in Tennessee. And I want to thank all the first responders who have been engaged in search and rescue. Providing timely relief to communities recovering from disasters is one of our most fundamental responsibilities as United States senators. Disasters made worse and more frequent by climate change are getting more frequent and more severe, and they're wreaking untold havoc on Americans across the country. This year alone, we've had 25 extreme weather and climate-related disasters which have claimed hundreds of lives and each cost over $1 billion in damages. As survivors navigate the long and arduous process of recovery, they can't afford to wait to get help. And so today we'll hear from our witnesses who all have extensive experience working on disasters about how Congress can better serve recovery needs. This past summer, Lahaina on the island of Maui experienced the nation's deadliest wildfire in more than a century. The fire killed 100 people and decimated entire neighborhoods. 2,200 structures, most of which were homes, were destroyed. For 4 months now, almost 7,000 people have been shuffling from one hotel room to the next. For many, rebuilding and recovery is still years away as debris removal is extensive and complex. Lahaina is just one example. Every community devastated by a disaster deserves help that is timely, predictable, consistent, and proportional to the needs of the recovery. And so while Congress took an important step in September to fund FEMA's disaster relief, much more is needed. In programs like CDBG DR, FEMA is only one piece of the puzzle. Congress has provided nearly $100 billion to HUD's CDBG DR program over the last 30 years. These funds have helped communities in nearly every state in the country to rebuild after disasters. At its best, the program provides needed resources to help the most impacted communities recover, but the way we currently run it does not make sense. By failing to authorize CDBG-DR, we force HUD to rewrite rules for funding every single time we finally get around to providing funding, meaning communities are left waiting for months or years for aid to arrive. And without certainty about when and how much aid will come, local governments end up doing some things twice and other things not at all. From a governance standpoint, it's wasteful and it's inefficient. And for survivors, the uncertainty and delay make the already difficult task of recovery even harder. This has to change. The bill that I've introduced with Senator Hyde-Smith, Senator Murray, Senator Collins, and others would permanently authorize the CDBG-DR program, enabling communities to plan faster and with greater clarity, and ultimately recover faster. Communities like West Maui that are in the throes of recovery need to know what resources they have to work with so they can make the best possible planning decisions. We can create a win-win scenario for everybody, all by streamlining the funding process. I'll close by reiterating, disaster-stricken communities like Lahaina desperately need help. It's our responsibility here in Congress to provide at least $2.8 billion of the request from the administration quickly and do it in a way that sets them up for success in the long run. And with that in mind, I'll turn over to my ranking member, Hyde-Smith, for her opening statement.
Thank you so much, Senator Schatz, and I certainly welcome our panel of witnesses today. The Honorable Sean Donovan, former Secretary of HUD and Director of OMB, now the CEO and President of Enterprise Community Partners, Jennifer Gray Thompson, founder and CEO of After the Fire USA, and Rand Reinhard, Director of Operations for the South Carolina Office of Resilience. Thank you for joining us this morning and your willingness to participate in this. This is so credibly important, and we appreciate you coming when we ask you to do that. I also would be remiss if I did not mention the deadly tornadoes that came through Tennessee on Saturday night, and our thoughts and prayers certainly go out to those in those communities and those who lost loved ones as they're trying to pick up the pieces and rebuild. Mississippi, where I am from, is also no stranger to the impact of natural disasters have on housing and the people and buildings that make up our community's infrastructure. I saw firsthand of devastation Hurricane Katrina caused the Mississippi Gulf Coast so many years ago when I assisted with the cleanup efforts. And this year, I have seen the wreckage from tornadoes destroying Mississippi towns, including those in Rolling Fork and others in our Mississippi Delta counties. All instances of natural disasters are heartbreaking. But Mississippians are resilient. From hurricanes and floods to storms and tornadoes. The people of Mississippi have weathered what Mother Nature has thrown at them, and we have way too much experience in that. However, there are times when these disasters can result in a scale of damage that local or even state governments are unable to mitigate without federal assistance. Helping to address this unmet need is an appropriate role for the federal government, and such federal engagement occurs through several agencies, including FEMA and the Small Business Administration, as well as HUD, which provides funding for long-term efforts through the CDBG Disaster Recovery Program. The regular CDBG program provides state and local governments with a flexible block grant, allowing local decisions and needs to drive the use of the funds. This flexibility has made CDBG one of HUD's most popular programs with state and local governments, as well as a program with tremendous bipartisan support within the THUD Appropriations Bill. The CDBG Disaster Relief Program maintains this flexibility, which is even more critical when responding to emergencies. I've fielded so many calls of people that have talked about restrictions, and the number one thing that they need is certainly the flexibility. Over the past 30 years, the CDBG DR program has provided nearly $100 billion in recovery efforts. These grants have been used to respond to hurricanes and winter storms, earthquakes and tornadoes, wildfire floods, lava flows, and even recovery from terrorist attacks. Although it has been a critical resource for disaster-affected communities, the CDBG DR program has never been authorized by Congress. The statutory framework for this program exists only in individual supplemental appropriation acts. In some cases, a single supplemental has covered disasters across multiple years. At other times, multiple appropriations have been provided for the same disaster. This ad hoc approach to CDBG-DR has meant that some grantees have had to administer multiple grants concurrently, applying slightly different rules and requirements for each grant. This approach has also had the unintended consequences of slowing the delivery of assistance to communities, sometimes by several years, making it more challenges for communities to proactively design effective disaster response programs. Natural disasters are not partisan in their impact, and our response should not be either. We should work on a bipartisan basis to improve existing programs like CDBG-DR for this reason. I am pleased to co-sponsor Senator Schatz and Collins's Reforming Disaster Recovery Act and hope the Banking Committee will take up this bill very soon. I look forward to hearing from today's panel and working to improve the way the federal government carries out its work. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Vice Chair Hyde-Smith. I'm encouraged to call you ranking member, but I'm insisting on calling you Vice Chair Hyde-Smith. I really appreciate our partnership, and this bill is a good example of the kind of practical work that we can do together if we set partisanship aside. It is a real pleasure to see my friend, and of course in this town everyone's a friend, but this guy is really a friend, an extraordinary United States Senator for the state of Vermont, someone with whom I've worked on a number of things: energy, foreign policy, and most particularly for this committee on recovering from our disasters, which happened within a couple of months of each other. So without further ado, Senator Peter Welch from Vermont. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I want to thank you, Senator Schatz, and you, Senator Hyde-Smith, for your work on this. And I also want to thank their committee. This committee is the place where we remind ourselves that we're all in it together. We're all Americans. There but for the grace of God goes the disaster that hit you. in Hawaii, Senator Schatz, and the terrible tornadoes and hurricanes you've had in Mississippi. So you bring us together and remind us that we're all one. In July, Vermont experienced several days of nonstop extreme rainfall. It wasn't a storm. It was just rain that wouldn't stop. We had nearly 9 inches of rain in a few days, causing flash flooding, washouts, and mudslides. One community, Cabot, Vermont, had damage to every single road in its town, and our capital, Montpelier, was completely underwater. Many businesses still have not reopened. It's been terrible. In total, almost 3,000 homes were damaged. There were almost 90 road closures. The Vermont Severe Weather, Flooding, and Loss and Damage Survey results estimate that 28,000 acres of ag land of concern to Mr. Bozeman were impacted. Hundreds of small businesses have filed claims. President Biden and his administration acted very quickly. The FEMA administrator did a tremendous job, was there on scene to provide reassurance and help right away. And our governor, Phil Scott, worked with state and local leaders and FEMA officials, and they got to work very effectively. And our delegation worked together to replenish FEMA's disaster relief fund, something you helped very much on, Senator Schatz. So those are dangerously low and need to be replenished. And while I'm grateful we were successful in supplementing the DRF, more must be done to give our communities the support they need to rebuild. The DRF is far from enough for the farmers, for the small businesses and the communities in my state and across the United States that have faced these disasters. When I toured damage in Vermont, I saw firsthand the way my community came together, and that's what's inspiring to all of us. Somehow they endure. But 6 months after the floods and the waters have receded, but thanks to the hard work of our first responders, community leaders, neighbors, and FEMA, and the generosity and kindness of strangers, Vermont is getting back on its feet. But if it was your farm, if it was your home, if it was your business, it's still really tough. Across the state, we're in the early stages of rebuilding those locations. But our small communities that don't have millions of dollars to rebuild dams without diverting from other needs like housing and healthcare are having a real trouble. That's why the Community Development Block Grant that you've been talking about, that disaster recovery and community development block grant mitigation funds are absolutely so critical. Your statement, Senator Hyde-Smith, is exactly right. They give us the flexibility that we need to rebuild now and prepare for the next flooding disaster. And it will come. We know that. Vermont needs substantial CDBG DR money to help low and moderate income communities fill in the gaps of insurance and state assistance. This money will help the state repair wastewater treatment plants, drinking water systems that suffered substantial damage. It'll take over $50 million to repair 5 dams in Ludlow, Vermont, small town, that were damaged by the floods. In Johnson, Vermont, wastewater treatment plant, which was washed out during the flood, is now running on what they call Frankenstein mode. It could fail at any time, a real catastrophe for that small community. And the CDBG funds will help impacted homeowners. Vermont is struggling with the lowest vacancy rates, a problem all across the country, and we need that help. Vermont has relied on the CDBG DR funds in the past to recover better from natural disasters. After Tropical Storm Irene in 2011, the town of Waterbury secured some of those funds to move buildings that had a history of flooding, and it really worked. They did not get impacted by the recent flooding. So these mitigation funds can help prevent future disasters. And I also want to say, by the way, New Hampshire, this is happening as far away as Florida and Hawaii, but also New Hampshire. For instance, New Hampshire communities in Sullivan and Cheshire County are also in need of resources to recover from the flooding. So failing to prioritize disaster funding now will leave our constituents feeling that their government has abandoned them, and that's a challenge. We don't want folks to have that feeling. Thank you again for hosting this hearing. And Chairman Schatz, it has been great working with you in your office under these incredibly challenging circumstances facing the people we represent. Thank you for the good work of this committee and the opportunity to testify.
Thank you very much, Senator Welch. We look forward to working with you to secure the resources and to establish the right policy framework together. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'll now introduce our second panel of witnesses before us today, and if you could take your seats while we do our introductions, I'd appreciate that. First, we turn to someone who needs no introduction to the subcommittee. Sean Donovan is currently the CEO and president of Enterprise Community Partners. Mr. Donovan was formerly the Secretary of HUD and Director of OMB under President Obama. Next, we have Jennifer Gray Thompson, founder and CEO of After the Fire USA, a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting wildfire-affected communities. Finally, we have Ran Reinhardt, who is Director of Operations for the South Carolina Office of Resilience, where he has helped to lead the state's CDBG DR and mitigation grants. Thank you all for joining us today to share your expertise. We have your written testimony, so if you can confine your remarks to 5 minutes, we would appreciate it. And Mr. Donovan, please proceed with your testimony.
Good morning, Chairman Schatz, Ranking Member Hyde-Smith, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today and for hosting this hearing on the crucial issue of disaster recovery. I'm Sean Donovan, as you heard, CEO of Enterprise Community Partners. We're a national nonprofit that addresses America's affordable housing crisis from every angle, including by creating sustainable and resilient homes and equipping communities to withstand and recover from natural disaster. I've spent my career working to improve the way public, private, and nonprofit sectors work for people and communities too often left behind. As HUD Secretary, I helped communities across the country recover from disasters and chaired the President's Hurricane Sandy Rebuilding Task Force. As OMB Director, I worked with Congress and federal agencies to better coordinate disaster response and recovery and better prepare for the worsening effects of climate change. In the wake of a disaster, people depend on government more than any other time in their lives. I've seen the impact that a well-funded, well-coordinated, efficient disaster response can have as communities grapple with recovery. Families can rebuild quickly and rebuild better, higher quality housing, able to withstand the next storm. I've helped communities wrestle with the wrenching decision to relocate to higher ground for a safer future. I'm also all too familiar with the challenges the government faces, challenges that can shake survivors' faith in their government and their community. I've seen families and businesses exhaust their insurance and FEMA benefits and have to put their lives on hold while waiting for delayed Community Development Block Grant disaster recovery funds. As extreme weather becomes more frequent and intense, we need to get better at response and recovery, particularly for low-income communities who bear a disproportionate impact. The best thing we can do after a disaster is to provide resources quickly and ensure they are reaching the people who need them most. The flexibility and targeting of CDBG-DR are tremendously successful because they help reach those with the greatest need. But CDBG-DR does not get money to communities quickly enough in their time of need due to a lengthy and multi-layered process. First, HUD only receives CDBG-DR dollars when Congress provides special appropriations with new legislative language each time, which often pushes funding into end-of-year spending negotiations. To put that in perspective, all of the communities who've experienced tragedies this year, including Maui, where the devastating wildfire took place over 4 months ago, are still waiting to even find out if they'll receive funding. Once money's appropriated, HUD writes new regulations for each allocation. State and local jurisdictions then start from scratch, developing new programs and guidelines to distribute the funds. This takes an average of 20 months, compounding delays and resulting in different rules for each disaster, leading to inequity within the process. The challenges are even greater in communities with fewer resources and less capacity, like small jurisdictions, rural areas, tribal trust lands, and Native communities. Limited governmental staffing, poor socioeconomic conditions, and unique land ownership make it harder to access and administer funds. To better serve these communities, we need to provide robust technical assistance and support, remove burdensome requirements, and work alongside tribal nations, Alaska Natives, and Native Hawaiians. The good news is there are straightforward solutions, which I detail in my written testimony. But the most important is to create a permanent CDBG-DR program with an allocation of funding that can be available soon after a disaster. Finally, we need to ensure communities are equipped to withstand disasters in the first place. Mitigation measures more than pay for themselves, saving an average of $6 in future disaster recovery costs for every dollar spent. I applaud Congress for the investments made through the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act to build resilience. We should build on that success with larger annual appropriations that will reduce the fiscal cost, but more importantly, the human cost of future disasters. Thank you again to the chair, ranking member, and all subcommittee members for your bipartisan leadership on this issue. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Donovan, and welcome back. Ms. Gray Thompson, please proceed with your testimony.
I didn't practice this part. Pushing the button. There we go. Okay. I'm so sorry. I need technical assistance. Like under-resourced communities, I need technical assistance. Okay, thank you. All right, thank you. Chairman Schatz, Ranking Member Hyde-Smith, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify on the critically important issue of DR funding and to discuss my experiences in navigating megafires. I am grateful for your leadership and attention to this issue. In this testimony, I hope to make three main points. Catastrophic disasters are profoundly traumatic for survivors. Current federal programs add recovery uncertainty and unnecessary delays, especially with respect to the Community Development Block Grant DR allocation and implementation timelines. Communities hit by disaster are typically unprepared and lacking resources, face subpar recoveries due to delays in federal funding and associated restrictions. This leads to slow, unequal recoveries, mass displacement, grant clawback issues, and over-reliance on consultants, burnout, and a loss of local expertise. Stable funding combined with AI technology can speed disaster recovery and increase equal access for all Americans post-disaster, but especially in under-resourced rural and frontier communities. Let me discuss each of these points in turn, starting with my own disaster story. Since October 8th, 2017, my life's work has been centered on wildfire, particularly megafires. On that evening, fast, hot winds downed power lines and sent fireball embers careening across mountains and valleys into my home of Sonoma County, as well as Napa, Lake, and Mendocino counties, killing 43 people, destroying 89 structures, and lasting over 24 days. I awakened that night to the overwhelming stench of smoke blanketing the Valley of the Moon, where I was raised and still reside. At that same moment, tens of thousands of people were hastily packing cars, loading their children and animals, then driving through rivers of fire to get to safety. Brave police officers were knocking on doors and risking their lives as they found evacuees running for their lives, barefoot and often naked, on ember-strewn roads. Most who perished were elderly and disabled, caught in their homes, unable to run, unable to lift garage doors, unable to get to safety. I lay out this visual because I need you to clearly understand what it means to be a megafire survivor. Megafires are not normal wildfires. They are hotter, faster, and deadlier. They destroy homes in under 3 minutes and move across football field lengths even faster. They run up mountains like blowtorches and can last 12 hours like the Marshall Fire in Boulder, Colorado, or over 100 days like the Dixie Fire in Plumas County, California. In a megafire, the power is out. The sky turns orange, the wind is fierce, and the only light to navigate comes from the fire. If you are lucky, a first responder or a neighbor catches you in their headlights and rescues you, and then they often return again and again into the hellish flames to find another terrified person. Megafires do not wait for people to find safe refuge. In Lahaina, people ran for their lives and often lost anyway. They swam in the ocean for hours, surrounded by flaming debris. Families were forced to leave their disabled members behind to the flames. Experiencing megafire is uniquely traumatic. It doesn't just destroy homes, it renders the landscape unrecognizable. After the Fire USA was created to help communities navigate megafires because the process is complicated, opaque, inefficient, and unfair to under-resourced communities, especially rural and frontier. Our tagline is recover, rebuild, and reimagine. Recover and rebuild are obvious. Reimagine is because they cannot return to their lives before the fire, but they can reimagine their communities after the fire if given the right tools in a timely manner. There is no bigger tool for the federal government than long-term recovery, than timely DR funding, but it is delayed by congressional approval. To be clear, codifying disaster block grant funding does not mean more funding, it means better delivery. I've been walking into communities after fire for 6 years, most recently Maui County. I've sat with hundreds of public officials and thousands of survivors and community leaders, and I must stress this point. They are doing their part in recovery. They are. But we need to do better as a nation. They ask me how long until we rebuild, and I cannot answer them. Last week, I brought a delegation of survivors and subject matter experts to sit with community leaders, and their top issue is housing. For Maui, Maui has not yet made a DR allocation. It's now 124 days passed since the disaster. And this is typical, and it's unclear exactly when the allocation will be made to them. I would like to introduce the idea also of AI, because AI, as scared as we are of it, can also introduce equity into these communities and reduce our over-reliance on consultants in recovery. This is a very important point and can dramatically change the entire space of disaster recovery. We are not asking for more. We are asking for better. Thank you again. Oh, I want to say this. There are families still to this day walking around Maui carrying their belongings in trash bags and buckets, literally doing that and being given 5 hours to move out of a hotel. And I think we can do better, and we can do it faster so that they can put down their trash bags and buckets and get all of the way home. And I want to thank you again for the opportunity to testify here on this important matter.
Thank you very much. Mr. Reinhardt, please proceed.
Chairman Schatz, Ranking Member Hyde-Smith, esteemed members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to provide testimony today regarding the critical issue of disaster recovery and how delayed funds affects communities, particularly in the context of HUD's Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery, or CDBG-DR program. I must thank Governor McMaster, who had the foresight to establish South Carolina Office of Resilience in the aftermath of 3 hurricane disasters between 2015 and 2018. I also want to thank my boss, South Carolina Chief Resilience Officer Ben Duncan, for allowing me to be here today. First, it's imperative to shorten the time between disaster impact and the arrival of disaster recovery funding, specifically HUD CDBGR funding. It takes too long for HUD's disaster recovery funds to get from HUD to grantees to citizens impacted by the disaster. Since 2015, South Carolina has been hit by 3 hurricanes that did enough damage to receive CDBGR funding. As an example of delay, in September 2018, South Carolina was hit by Hurricane Florence. It took until December of 2020 before HUD disaster recovery funds were available to us. This is far too long for communities to wait for recovery. Delays in funding significantly impact low-income, low-resource, and historically underserved communities. People waiting for recovery to happen whose homes have been damaged have 2 choices: live in the damaged home or move on. Many citizens lacking monetary resources or insurance just choose to leave. When they leave, their departure erodes the community's tax base, which puts additional challenges on rural and historically low-resource communities. So how could this delay in disaster recovery funds getting to communities and citizens be shortened? Provide HUD with a steady funding stream of appropriated funding so they can rapidly provide disaster recovery grants to disaster-impacted states or communities. This will reduce or prevent citizens from losing hope and leaving their communities. Second, we believe it's vital that HUD change its minimum damage threshold. The current formula incorporates a minimum damage threshold requiring counties to exceed $10 million in serious unmet housing need and zip codes to surpass $2 million. This threshold disproportionately disadvantages low-income communities with lower housing values, effectively excluding them from receiving critical assistance. By example, in one coastal county of South Carolina, the median home price is over $300,000. There are also many beachfront homes that are over $1 million in value each. In a nearby rural county, there's an underserved neighborhood where the average home value is below $53,000. Following a disaster, the beachfront county would easily hit the $10 million threshold with just a few homes, while the nearby rural county, hit by the same storm, would have to have almost 200 homes substantially damaged to be considered for meeting HUD's damage threshold. The greater need is obviously for this rural community with many damaged homes, rather than a beachfront community with just a few. Actual impact and unmet needs should be considered rather than an artificial dollar value methodology. HUD should revise or replace their minimum damage threshold with a more equitable and dynamic approach that considers factors just beyond housing costs, such as poverty levels, population density, social vulnerability, and the severity of the disaster's impact. Third, not all grantees have the same capacity to handle large CDBG-DR grants. Grantees who do not regularly deal with large and complex federal grants can become easily overwhelmed, plan poorly, and waste valuable tax dollars executing recovery programs that provide minimal outcomes, all with the best of intent. We suggest that HUD set first-time or small-capacity grantees up for success by providing immediate and competent technical assistance. This assistance needs to be provided immediately after a disaster once HUD knows that a DR grant is likely. Fourth, we believe that HUD should require states at a minimum to have a resilience plan. These plans should lay out how states will recover from disasters, how they will build back better and in a more resilient manner. They must look forward using data to develop the standards for the recovery. Building homes and infrastructure against what happened 10 years ago is a formula for future failure. Grantees need to build against the conditions they will likely see 50 years from now. Having these plans prior to disasters will not only help communities better absorb the disaster impacts, they'll also shrink the recovery time. Finally, currently HUD provides a 15% setback of funding for mitigations to grantees receiving DR funding. While this is helpful, it's not enough, and it's reactive in nature. The mitigation needs are substantial and far outstrip that 15% set aside. While it's helpful, a grantee could easily spend 15% of the set aside on a single mitigation project. Historically, every dollar put into hazard mitigation saves about $6 in disaster recovery. So why not spend less up front before the disaster than more after the disaster? In conclusion, HUD's CDBG-DR programs play a vital role in supporting communities during the long-term recovery from natural disasters. However, the current model for DR can be improved to deliver successful recovery outcomes to those who need it most. The South Carolina Office of Resilience supports the reforms to HUD's CDBG-DR program and believes it will allow HUD to better assist all communities of disaster that are at risk of disaster. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Senator Hyde-Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Gray-Thompson, I am particularly interested in your experiences on the ground and working with these families that have been affected. And these families obviously are the essentially the end users of the programs and processes that we as appropriators at state and federal agencies put into place. But despite the central importance of these individuals and families, their direct experiences with these programs are likely not taken into consideration as often as they should be. And we're always looking for insight from those of you who have that direct contact. What insights can you share about the experiences of disaster-affected individuals and families when dealing with federal disaster response and recovery programs? What would you like for us to know that you think would be helpful to us?
I would like to know how to turn my mic. I got it, okay. I would like you to know that, you know, every community, when they go through a disaster, the first thing they find is it's the shock and the trauma, but the secondary trauma comes from dealing with the federal government. A lot of the denials, and we understand that fraud is a major issue, but they're always very surprised by the processes and the programs that we have in place. This is never more true in areas that have distrust of government. I see this in rural communities, like in Plumas County, even in Butte County with the Camp Fire, but I see it a lot in Maui because there's the historical problems around colonialism, and so that adds into it as well. The experiences of these families are incredibly challenging because they can't believe how slow it is. It's the uncertainty, and they can do much better if they just had, even if within a 12-month period idea of when they can get home. In a mega fire, we have nothing to muck. It's all gone. We don't have any blue tarps. Our cars are gone. It's 3 inches of oily ash. And so that alone is shocking, but then to actually have to navigate the very slow system, especially with regard to housing. Housing is medicine. It's how people get home. All of us, like, think about if you had to come to work today and your stuff is in a bucket, and you had to move hotels 4 times last week, but you're still working 3 jobs because you didn't hear that you can defer your mortgage. And it feels there's secondary trauma that comes all the time from how our system operates. And I feel like as really the seat of innovation in this country, that we can certainly do better by them. So thank you for that question.
And while I am pleased to co-sponsor the Reforming Disaster Recovery Act, I recognize that there remains a potentially long road ahead and many conversations yet to be had in the Senate as well as with the House before getting this authorization enacted. But unfortunately, while the legislative process is ongoing, the need for disaster recovery work is ongoing as well. And it is clear that program and process improvements should not wait until we get the authorization across the finish line, because we know how slow this can be. So, Mr. Donovan and Mr. Reinhardt, relying on your years of experiencing navigating the CDBG-DR funding and requirements, what can HUD do now without waiting for passage of the authorization bill to improve the effectiveness of either the state and local grantees or the experience of the individual and the families that rely on this assistance to rebuild their lives and community? And Mr. Donovan, we'll start with you.
Thank you, Senator.
The first thing I would say is that moving quickly within the allocations that HUD receives is absolutely critical. Giving certainty, giving it as early as possible, and even before there's perfect information, there's data still being collected about the depth of the needs, to move quickly with initial allocations that allow communities to start planning and move forward. I would also say, and Jennifer mentioned this a moment ago, the specific needs of smaller communities, tribal and rural communities, is especially important. And so what I saw in my experience is that the kind of technical assistance that we've talked about is enormously important, but also, for example, working to build regional partnerships. If you have a community that literally has one part-time staffer who's responsible for doing the planning, but you have communities, say, in Mississippi, I saw this regularly, small communities along the coast that are all facing very similar issues. Bringing them together for regional convenings and regional technical assistance can be an important piece. The other part I would say on that is showing flexibility where there are needs to do waivers or other steps. And another example from Mississippi, the ability to work closely with nonprofit partners or others. Habitat for Humanity was enormously important in the recovery after Katrina, and there needed to be some changes to CDBG-DR and to provide flexibility to be able to work with those organizations more effectively. I think there are things that Congress could do in the permanent authorization on that, but there is work that can be done with at HUD along those lines.
So when you talk about the assistance of the technical adventures there, you're saying to have someone to help these people, a greater staff, broader staff as people come in?
Exactly right. So the ability to get technical experts, contractors that can step in very quickly help communities, particularly smaller rural communities, understand the rules. It's especially true right now because each allocation is different under CDBG-DR, that there need to be changes to the programs based on the specific statutory language. That compounds the problem and is one reason why having a permanent authorization would help. But that sort of hand-holding and working with communities to say, here's the way you put together an action plan, here's the way you work with HUD, here's what other communities have done that's innovative, that worked well, maybe you could replicate that. All of those things are really important, especially for smaller and rural and tribal communities.
Okay, and Mr. Reinhardt?
Thank you, Senator. I'd break it down to just a couple things. One, I'll echo what Mr. Donovan said, which is technical assistance. You got to get it to them pretty quickly, especially if they're a first time or they're a small capacity grantee. That can come in the form of either contractors, HUD staff, or just other grantees that have gone through the same experience. In 2015, when we were hit, and we hadn't been hit since Hugo in '89, we called everybody. We called Mississippi, we called Louisiana, we called Texas, and asked them what worked and what didn't work. And that was very helpful in developing our program. I think HUD can also immediately get into, make CDBG, the program, and the Federal Register that comes out for it a little more predictable. It doesn't need to change every time. They could stick the timeline up front, make it easy for people to read and grantees to understand. Here's the timeline that you're facing. How many days do you have before you got to get an implementation plan? How many days before financial certifications are due? How long is HUD going to take to review it? Let them know early on, as much as possible, that they are going to get a grant so that they can pass that on to their people and build expectation management. If no word comes out, people sit with no hope. But if they know something's coming, even if it's going to take a little while to get there, that at least gives them hope. And the last thing I'd say is, let's get ahead of the disasters. Let's go to communities, have HUD go to the communities, and train those small communities that have yet to be hit on how, if and when you get hit, this is how you do disaster recovery. Thank you, Senator.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Hyde-Smith. Senator Bozeman.
Thank you, Senator Schatz and Senator Hyde-Smith, for having this hearing. This is so important. You know, we can argue about climate change and this and that, but certainly the torrential rains that we're having, the drought, the dryness that results of that, the fires. So I think you made a great point, Ms. Thompson. You know, we're not talking, in some cases we're talking about spending more money, but so much of this is just being more efficient and making the process work. I'm the ranking member on agriculture, and we see this with the relief programs there. You know, it's difficult to go through the process, and then you wait 2 years, you know, before you actually get any relief. By that time, it's more than difficult. So, Mr. Reinhardt, Arkansas has had a series of tornadoes in the last several years that have caused significant damage. We're seeing this in Tennessee, you know, just in the last day or so. One of the main frustrations I've heard from state and community leaders is how long the process, as we've talked about, all of you all have talked about, see the appropriated federal funding on the ground. A few months ago, I introduced myself and Senator Padilla a bill that would help streamline the process of economic development administration by creating an Office of Disaster Recovery and Resilience that assists EDA in being proactive rather than reactive when it comes to these disasters. Can you discuss how organizing our current federal disaster assistance programs, like setting up an Office of Disaster Recovery and Resilience at EDA, can help communities in need?
Thank you, Senator. It's one-stop shopping. If you can go to, if a citizen has to go to one place, whether it's FEMA, it's HUD, or one federal agency, it would really be nice to go to one place and be able to meet all your needs to solve, you know, work all the programs. Otherwise, you know, when a disaster occurs, you have multiple agencies pouring onto the site, all with the best of intent, but it quickly overwhelms, especially low to moderate income citizens. Most of the South Carolina clients for our disaster recovery program are over 65 years old. And they struggle sometimes to have the paperwork necessary, and all these agencies are calling them. And if you had one that would take care of it all, that would be very simplistic and would actually not only streamline the process, because then that data could be shared across other agencies to bring other programs to it, but would also just make it easier on the citizen. A lot of times the citizens get confused, they get frustrated, they get tired, and they then don't participate in the disaster recovery program. So absolutely, Senator, if you could put one-stop shopping, make it one center point, the people that show up after the disaster could be that people. Now, which agency that is, that's not for me to decide. There are some great options, because there are some great people both in FEMA, HUD, SBA, EDA, all those agencies. But if you can make it more simplistic, that would really help this average citizen to participate in the recovery program.
Anybody else?
I completely concur, and I think that even if it's not through an agency, and I know I'm going to push here for tech, we know how to do this. TurboTax has been doing this for years. It's an if-then scenario, and I don't do individual assistance. I mostly work with leaders or people who are serving families, and so and they're always that shock of how the system works. Most of them have low civic education. They don't know the EDA exists. And so asking for technical assistance, they don't know that they can send an email to FEMA and say, we have, low capacity, can you just provide us, this is what we need. That is one of the possibilities. But if you don't even know, they don't even know what the Federal Registry is. They don't know. And then this disaster comes, and I think about Supervisor Kevin Goss out of Plumas County. He was the board chair. Then he lost his pharmacy in the fire. Then he had 100 days of fire coming 4 times at his home in Taylorsville. Then he had to be the interim CAO of Plumas County and the auditor, all of 4 of those things at once while navigating this unprecedented disaster and the loss of Greenville. So him even figuring out what the EDA is, this is like an if-then scenario, even if it's not centralized in one agency, but just that it feeds you also the language so that you're not getting clawbacks, because otherwise it's nearly impossible for an under-resourced community to navigate it and get what's allocated is one thing, what's accessed is another. Where I live in Sonoma County, we got everything that we were entitled to, and we have the first BRIC grant for wildfire. Very different scenario. $2 billion a year budget. So the inequity there is so painful every time I walk into a community.
Very good. Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, I want to compliment you all. We hear so much about all the rancor that's going on up here. This is not a Democrat or Republican thing. This is just trying to figure out how to help people. And you two and your staffs do a good job of that. So give yourselves a pat.
Thank you very much, Senator Boozman. And we look forward to working with all members of this committee to try to get this enacted. And I take the point that there are some things that we should do along the way, not putting all of our eggs in the enactment basket. But, in my experience, the thicket is going to be really hard to clear if we're still in the thicket. And so I think we need a statute here to come over the top. I have a bunch of questions, so if you could be as brief as possible, I'd really appreciate it. Just from each of you, one example of how delay materially impacts people, causes more suffering. Because I think to Ms. Gray Thompson's point, there's a lot of letters, there's a lot of acronyms, there are a lot of agencies, and even for those of us who are in the business, it can get a little bit labyrinthine. So I just want to understand, why should we pass this bill? I mean, we know it'll speed things up, but again, why does that matter? Give me an example of how the delay hurts people who are suffering. Go ahead, Mr. Donovan.
Senator, I'll never forget a house that I was in helping rebuild with a volunteer group after the Katrina and other storms hit the Gulf Coast. This was an elderly couple. The wife was suffering from Alzheimer's. And because of the delay and the uncertainty, they took the relatively small amount of money they got from their FEMA individual assistance, started to rebuild their home, but didn't have enough money to do it properly. Mold developed in the walls. And fast forward a year later, the mold was so bad, they literally had to rip the walls apart. And when we went into the home, they had been living for months with just bare studs, a senior couple waiting to know whether CDBG would be available to them. And it was heartbreaking to see. And just to add to that, as a human cost, the fiscal cost is also terrible. And Senator Boozman just raised this. It's not that we're going to do with the same amount of money, we can actually save substantial money. As a former budget director, think about that family. Had they known what they were getting, they could have done it once, not only done it better and not had the human and the fiscal costs to them, but also longer term made their home safer. They could have lowered the cost in the next disaster.
I'll just thank you for that. And I'll just point out, on Maui, there is nothing cheap about moving people from hotel room to hotel room. If we could get some, even if it's modular, even if it's mobile, if we get people under a roof as immediately as possible, that saves the taxpayer dollar. Ms. Thompson.
Journey's End in Sonoma County and Santa Rosa, actually Enterprise Community Partners was a partner of ours on that. It was a mobile home park, vulnerable communities, seniors. They had several fatalities there alone. And it took, we just completed a rebuild of a multifamily unit instead because mega fires destroy the infrastructure under the ground, so it really changes how it is that we rebuild. We just completed affordable housing to replace that. We finished it about 3 months ago. We are over 6 years post-disaster. Those people could have been home.
Mr. Reinhardt.
2016, Nichols, South Carolina, a community of probably like 300 or 400 people was hit. Every building except the city hall took flooding. 2018, the city hall took flooding as well as every building. People moved away. They have left the town, and many have not come back. That town will never be the same. Delays in recovery and just the hope that something's coming that way causes people to leave. Could not promise them immediately after the disaster when something was coming their way. So that kind of delay does, without hope, people will move, they'll go start their lives somewhere else, and that just kills the community.
Thank you. Mr. Donovan, you mentioned the research that Enterprise has conducted on rental markets after a disaster. Can you expand on those findings, and how can CDBG-DR authorization help?
It's such a critical question, Senator, because we tend to focus, rightly so, on folks who are directly impacted, whether their home is destroyed, they lose their school, but in fact, what we've seen in this research is that entire communities suffer because in the wake of disasters, because housing supply is more limited, rents go up for everyone. And what we found, interestingly, is that those rent increases are cut in half when communities get CDBG-DR. So you not only have the direct benefits to those who get assistance, you have community benefits where housing costs are lower for everyone in that community.
And the question is not whether CDBG-DR comes in and does that, it's whether it comes in time to save what constitutes these communities. Ms. Gray Thompson and Mr. Reinhardt, each of you have described what it's like to be in a small rural community. What kind of capacity do you need to simultaneously respond, plan for, and manage recovery well?
A lot. And I have no better way of saying it than that, but if you have a community that has like 15 to 30,000 people in it versus where I live, which is 500,000 people, your pool is just much larger. Your tax base is much larger. You're naturally going to be able to pull more people into the recovery. And remember that every time a community is hit by a disaster, the entire community does all of the hard work and all of the, we call it the slog of recovery, for years. This is why we have an over-reliance on contractors. I'm not saying there isn't a place for that, but then contractors, it can take as much as 20% out of the funding, out of the community that should be landing on the ground. And so it's a very difficult situation, but it's almost impossible for a rural or frontier community to come back in anywhere close to a suburban or well-resourced one. In the case of Maui, it's particularly concerning. Pretty good budget, but low capacity, but high land values, but low incomes. So it's a little more unusual. It's kind of like a rural situation or frontier, but with some of the problems.
But with San Francisco prices.
Thank you, that, exactly, yeah.
You can tell I've been doing some thinking about this.
Yes, yes.
Mr. Reinhardt.
Thank you, Senator. A lot is really a good answer. Small communities, the town I talked about, Nichols, they don't have a full-time mayor, they have a full-time clerk. To manage a disaster recovery program, no matter what size, takes not only people, but it takes expertise in the thing. Federal systems, even trying to get grants prior to disasters to help prevent, are hard to navigate and require a certain level of expertise. What can be done? Well, one, we just need to have maybe some programs to help those communities develop that expertise, or agencies, and in South Carolina, that's my agency, trying to help those communities to put in for those grants, to give them the expertise, just lend it to them. There are also some great nonprofits out there that have an ability to help them do some grants. Nichols is an example where a nonprofit went in and was able to get them a FEMA grant to help address some of their issues with flooding, to help mitigate. But they need a lot of assistance, and it's got to be good, competent people.
You have talked about the need to get some money in right away for sort of capacity building and immediate response. Our bill will allow HUD to support pre-disaster assistance and to quickly release a small amount of funding to begin planning and building capacity. Would that help?
Absolutely, Senator. Look, in 2015, we started from scratch. If I get money quickly after the disaster, I can hire staff, I can train that staff, I can get a needs assessment to let me know what kind of disaster I'm facing, and I can start that planning process so I can be quicker on my end. I know I can't change the HUD timeline, but I can be quicker on my end. I won't take 120 days to get to my action plan. It'll take me about 30 or so. And having had a little experience in this, I have one sitting on the shelf right now, unfortunately. But also I can start the intake of disaster survivors and start meeting their other needs while reassuring them housing is coming on the way. That's what I could do with money early on, Senator.
Thank you very much. Ms. Thompson, anything to add to that?
I completely agree. The other thing is that it could fund more mutual aid from other communities. We've never charged a community to come in and do mutual aid, but I design the delegations according to what I think they need at that time. So I brought in like the head of our building department, Tennis Wick from Sonoma County, and then they immediately needed so much from him. And just to provide funds for that, we're willing to help each other. We're willing to do all of our parts, but there's really there's no funding for that either, that kind of mutual aid.
I think it's a really important point. I mean, we had CAL FIRE folks come in, and we've had lots of expertise come in, especially from Paradise. But I think the challenge is that the economics of having sort of deep expertise and people at the ready in case something happens, like it becomes untenable if you're doing this county by county by county across the country. So there's some facilitation role. I don't think the federal government can fund expertise in every disaster management agency, but it can facilitate the sharing of resources and expertise. And, we needed money immediately, we needed safety immediately, but, sort of those were 1A and 1B. But right beneath that was like, Maui County is an interesting place because even compared to Kauai County or Hawaii Island or the island of Oahu, the city and county of Honolulu, they've had less experience with disasters for whatever set of reasons. There's some people who think there are sort of a topographic, weather-related reasons. Other people think it was just that they were fortunate until now. But Maui hadn't contended with either of the major hurricanes or tropical storms, obviously no lava disasters, and suddenly a relatively well-run county finally was faced with a true, human catastrophe. And so we were sharing our emergency managers from the other islands and all the rest of it, but some formalization of that process so it doesn't depend on everyone sort of just texting each other and flying in to Kahului and having a meeting and saying, here's what I did and all the rest of it. Mr. Donovan, you've noted the particular challenges in tribal trust lands and in Native communities. What do you think are the most problematic challenges? And do you see any, and this isn't a trick question, are there any distinctions, in terms of our policy here between a super remote rural area and a tribal community on a reservation land? Because I'm the chairman of the Indian Affairs Committee, and I'm very sensitive to these issues, but it seems to me that in terms of the authorization bill that we're contemplating, that most of these challenges rhyme with each other. There may be, individual differences, but it seems to me that the problems of Native communities are the problems of rural communities and under-resourced communities. Are there differences that you've observed?
Absolutely. And just first to echo the point you just made about technical assistance and sharing information and best practices, I like to say, if you've just been through a 1 in 100-year event, by definition, there's no one alive in your community who's seen that before. And so enormously important to look beyond your borders and to have ways that the federal government can do that. Specifically, I think the challenges are largely shared in terms of not having staff or expertise, being in remote areas, costs can be higher as a result of that. So there are many shared challenges between remote communities and tribal. But a couple things that I would say, one very specific is the nature of ownership of land can be quite different. The nature of access to other programs, low-income housing tax credits in the housing world or many others, simply aren't usable. And so it is very important that there be specific recognitions of how land is owned and conveyed in those communities, and making sure that what other sources are available, for example, NAHASDA funds, can work effectively, which are quite different from the way you might be rebuilding in remote areas in terms of the funding. There's also just an obvious example, but one that we've seen come up is prioritization, for example, where there's access to transit or other things is a common challenge that you see. The last thing I would just say, Senator, is that there are significant land ownership issues in low-income communities, rural communities, that are not specific to tribal lands that we haven't mentioned here today, but I think are really important. I've seen, whether it's on the Gulf Coast, in Puerto Rico, in a range of places where low-income communities often don't have clear title to land. There may be 10 or 15 relatives who share ownership, and many of those communities often are denied FEMA benefits, are denied the ability to get CDBG-DR without clear title, and there's ability to provide flexibility, but I think some statutory reform on that would be enormously important as well.
Thank you very much. If there are no further questions from members, I just have a couple of comments to wrap up. It is not cheaper to do things the way that we are currently doing them. I have a focus, I think we all have a focus on the humanity of this, the fact that a delay is not just a sort of irritant, it is a life or death question for individuals and also for communities. And so this idea that we should do this thing because it'll make it more efficient sort of is a bloodless way to describe it, right? Because you've all been out there on the front lines and you understand that individual people suffer because we haven't gotten our act together to have a program that is predictable. And when we establish this program, it will also be imperfect. But this is beyond imperfect. The program basically doesn't exist until we do individual appropriations. And then understandably, disaster managers have their own challenges, 100-year storms, therefore no pre-existing capacity. But they're also trying to navigate something that is not just not clear to them because they're new to this, but not clear to anyone, including the Secretary of HUD and members of Congress that represent those communities impacted. So there's nothing cheap or fiscally conservative about continuing to push out tens of billions of dollars for CDBG-DR and not have an authorized program. It's just the most extraordinarily inept way for us to push these resources out. We're not going to stop pushing these resources out. The question is whether we're going to do so in an efficient manner. That's number one point. The number 2 point is, and I suffer from this, I think we all a little bit suffer from this disease, we've got to figure out a way to describe this bill in ways that don't sound like alphabet soup and sound like we are servicing the needs of the bureaucracy, right? It's literally the opposite. It's to try to make, process in service of the people rather than people in service of the process, right? And that's what we're trying to do. And yet when we describe it, I find myself neck deep in acronyms, which, thankfully I now understand, but still makes it very difficult to sell to other members because they've got other priorities. And as soon as we talk about, CDBG, DR, EDA, DERF, whatever, even the smart ones' eyes glaze over. And so we've got to collectively figure out a way to talk about this that expresses the urgency fiscally, but also at the human level. We have received letters and written testimony in support of efforts to make communities safe and give them the resources that they need to recover. I'm going to submit the following to the record, for the record, without objection. Written testimony from Senator Sanders regarding ongoing recovery needs in Vermont. Testimony from Marion McFadden, the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Office of Community Development and Planning on HUD's efforts and goals related to CDBG-DR. A letter signed by the National League of Cities, National Association of Counties, National Low-Income Housing Coalition, Enterprise, and 85 other organizations supporting our bill. A letter from the Bipartisan Policy Center's Disaster Response Reform Task Force, and a statement from the American Flood Coalition supporting authorization, a statement from the International Code Council, and a letter signed by 27 organizations working in disaster-impacted areas on behalf of the Disaster Housing Recovery Coalition in support of CDBG-DR funding and authorization. The hearing record will remain open until next Wednesday, December 20th, 2023, to allow members to submit additional questions for the record, and this hearing is now adjourned.